Hello mortals, Discordian Kitty here. Have you heard that players are choosing to stay grounded during questing in midnight to enhance their experience? I have. This trend has been everywhere. Reddit, Bellular, Taliesin and Evertel, even Blizzard themselves have officially announced they've noticed it and agree that grounded questing is better. And that's why I had to make this video, because I couldn't disagree more. I was already nervous when I saw the discourse beginning, but Blizzard's recent response to it has upgraded my reaction to full-on alarmed. In a recent blog post, Blizzard announced that steady flight would no longer be locked behind the pathfinding achievement. A long overdue change, especially for those who have accessibility issues with Skyriding. In the same post, Blizzard highlighted some of their philosophy around flight, their reasoning for both the original restriction and their decision to lift it. The post repeats several myths about flight that concern me greatly, especially when it ends off with a hint that they might take it upon themselves to try encourage, and I use that term loosely, the so-called superior grounded experience. In the future, we will continue to look at how the ability to fly affects our play experiences. Since the release of Midnight, we've seen some great discussion about how Midnight hits different from a ground mount, and we agree. It's fun experiencing quests at a less frenetic pace than that which is enabled through flight, and it's rewarding to engage with the world from the ground level. While we don't have any plans to restrict flight access meaningfully in the future, we'll keep these discussions in mind as we continue building WoW. So, I would like to take this opportunity to throw down my own gauntlet. I refuse to allow this myth that grounded experience is superior to continue unchallenged. Flight doesn't just increase my enjoyment of the game, it increases my enjoyment of the story. And I don't think I am the only one. Being grounded has always been something that actively harms my enjoyment of the lore rather than enhances it. So while I absolutely do believe anyone who says they prefer to quest grounded, I'd like to present the case for flight. But before I can do that, we need to go over the history of flight in this game. As I said, Blizzard recently officially announced that they've noticed the pro-grounded questing discourse. This was as part of a forum post announcing that steady flight would no longer be locked behind pathfinding, a long overdue change. Blizzard's explanation for why they held off on this change for so long, as well as their reasoning for changing it now, is honestly a bit weird. Frankly, Blizzard's attitude towards flight and pathfinding has always been a bit weird. Players couldn't always fly in World of Warcraft. It was something that was introduced with the first expansion, the Burning Crusade, as a special Outland-specific perk that could only be earned at max level. Flying also came in different speeds back then. The slowest was very slow, and the fastest was so expensive, plenty of players just wouldn't bother with it. You also had to purchase flight individually for every alt. Account-wide wasn't really much of a thing back then. Of course, the next expansion, Wrath of the Lich King, was in Northrend. Blizzard realized they couldn't avoid giving players flying in the new zone. After Burning Crusade, they came to expect it. But they compromised by, once again, making it only available at the new max level and locked behind a flight style. This one was cold weather flying. Then came Cataclysm. This expansion revamped most of the old world and also properly introduced flight to Azeroth. Now it's the zones that didn't have flight, like the Blood Elf and Draenei starting areas, that were the unusual ones. You also didn't need to reach max level to fly in the Cataclysm zones. You just needed to buy a flight license. In other words, this was the first expansion where players experienced the story with flight. Now, I started playing during the Burning Crusade, but I only got into endgame in Cataclysm. It was the expansion where I made Blood Bubbles, my beloved goblin main. It was the expansion where I tried out raiding for the first time. It was also the expansion where I started to really pay attention to the story for the first time. I'd always loved Warcraft 3's story, but as far as World of Warcraft was concerned, I was mostly clueless. And this is because Cataclysm introduced convenience that allowed me to free up time that would be spent on tedious drudgery, and instead transfer it to actually focus on things I found interesting, like the story. Semi-early access to flight was one of these changes, but another one was the Dungeon Finder. And I know a lot of people bemoan the addition of the Dungeon Finder, but I want you to think about something. I and many others never entered a single dungeon before that dungeon finder tool. When people think back all starry-eyed to early days of players seeking each other out and building groups to experience the challenge of a dungeon together, I have no doubt that was a wonderful experience. It was also not one shared by a lot of people. It made dungeons completely inaccessible to a lot of people, effectively locking anyone who wasn't able to organize a group like that out of experiencing large parts of the story. Cataclysm brought a lot of convenience that has been bemoaned by purists ever since. That convenience made the game more accessible, and therefore more fun for a lot of people, including myself. But boy, did we hear about how it actually ruined the game, and have been hearing about it ever since. By Mists of Pandaria, Blizzard themselves seem to be thoroughly regretting allowing flight too early in Cataclysm, and they returned to requiring max level and a new special flight skill, Wisdom of the Four Winds, before flight was unlocked for any character in Pandaria. And then came Warlords of Draenor. Warlords of Draenor introduced Draenor, an alternative universe version of Outland, one that hadn't been destroyed yet. Outland had introduced flight, which by this time Blizzard was clearly regretting, and so Blizzard thought Warlords of Draenor would be a great time to take it away. Draenor was not going to be a zone that would allow flight, ever. Flight was not unlocked at max level. It was not unlocked with the first patch, and in fact the plan was to pretty much never allow players to unlock it again. As patch 6.2 approached, while players were clamoring for flight, Ian Hazzikostas did an interview with Polygon in which he casually mentioned their plans to pretty much remove flight indefinitely. The world feels larger, more dangerous, he says. There's more room for exploration, for secrets, for discovery, and overall immersion in the world. At this point, we feel that outdoor gameplay in World of Warcraft is ultimately better without flying. We're not going to be reintroducing the ability to fly in Draenor, and that's kind of where we're at going forward. I will go into Ian's reasoning soon enough, but needless to say, this announcement was met with immediate and massive backlash. Warlords of Draenor is not an expansion that did well. It was riddled with content droughts and controversies. One of those controversies, perhaps the biggest one, was the one about flying. Patch 6.2 was also the final patch. Warlords of Draenor is notoriously remembered as being an expansion that had to be cut short. And while I won't claim Blizzard's attempts to restrict flying was the sole reason for the expansion's failure, as I said, there was also massive problems with content drought, not to mention behind the scenes complications we'll probably never know about. The lack of flight didn't help. The controversy surrounding it was absolutely devastating to that expansion's reputation. It didn't make players enjoy the story more or appreciate the expansion more. It just made the entire situation worse. Blizzard themselves severely underestimated how strongly players felt about flying. Ian did that interview in May 2015. By the very next month, June 2015, Blizzard had already reversed course, announcing that flight would be unlocked in Draenor after all. According to a PC Gamer article from the time, such was the outcry that news of Draenor's massive 6.2 patch had started to fade into the background. Then, earlier this week, lead game designer Ian Hazzikostas announced that the studio had reversed its position. Flying mounts are in, but with a catch. That catch was the introduction of pathfinding. Pathfinding was a new achievement that would allow you to fly, but it would require not only achieving max level and not only completing the storyline, but you would also have to fully explore Draenor, complete every Draenor assault, earn revered reputation with all 3 of the new factions being introduced in 6.2, and discover 100 Draenor treasures. As far as Blizzard was concerned, this was the perfect solution because they believed it still forced the experience they wanted onto players. And while they were forced to walk back on their no more flight plan, their comments at the time still showed they never really understood why players were so upset. We thought at the time that we had the right answer, but what we heard from the community is that once the word never was out there, it changed the conversation a little bit. A little bit? No kidding. There's a certain terrible finality to the word never. Before, people might have accepted not being able to fly in Draenor, but when they started to realize that, wow, I'll never be able to use Invincible's reins or Mimiron's head, or some other prized possession that they've worked for, suddenly that sparked an emotional response. And I'm just going to take a moment here to marvel at how unbelievably patronizing and dismissive the statement was, and how incredibly it missed the point. It couldn't possibly be that a lot of players enjoy flying because it enhances their experience, increases immersion, and makes them enjoy the game more. That this whole grounded tedium makes the game more fun attitude simply isn't true for everyone. No, it must just be that players were emotional. I think we're very happy with the final compromise. The solution was to preserve our original design goal of ensuring players are exploring the world and experiencing it from the ground, and getting to appreciate its scope and its size, and engaging the gameplay aspects of exploration and mystery. Then, once they've done that, there's no reason not to allow them to fly and navigate in all dimensions throughout the world, and also unlock that ability for their alts. Pathfinder went on to become the new norm, a way to force players to stay grounded for at least the first few patches of any expansion. In Legion, it was introduced in 2 parts, with the second half, the one that rewarded flying, only being introduced in patch 7.2. Battle for Azeroth continued this trend, with the second Pathfinder only coming in patch 8.2. With Shadowlands, Blizzard decided to adjust their approach a little. As usual, the expansion opened with no flight. In fact, they even had a zone where they removed the ability to mount up at all. If you tried to call your mount in the maw, it wouldn't come. In fact, leaning into the idea that less convenience equals more fun, Blizzard decided that the maw would be a painful zone in general by design. In an interview with Mine MMO, developer Kevin Martins explained the reasoning behind some of the design decisions in the maw. We tried to make it really difficult. No matter what goals you have for the day, they can be accomplished alone. But when you encounter other players, you will be glad about it and think, oh, what a stroke of luck, there's someone else here. But you cannot stay forever, as there is the system of the Eye of the Jailer. It will often be the case that you think, damn, I didn't finish everything today. I'll have to wait till tomorrow to explore that other corner, because the jailer is already on my tail. This fits well into the story and also into the gameplay, to keep the area fresh by not allowing you to complete everything in one sitting. We don't want you to complete all your goals there in a single session, but rather from a narrative perspective, not from a gameplay perspective. The idea is that this is the realm of the jailer and he is watching you, much like the Eye of Sauron. The jailer is watching all the time. He sees everything that happens there. Do you see how dangerous it is when Blizzard attempts to use gameplay, specifically inconvenience, to try reinforce enjoyment of the narrative? And do you remember how successful this was? According to a Wowhead article about a Sloot interview with Paul Cubitt, and I would just refer to the original interview itself, but it doesn't seem to be up anymore, mounting was restricted in the maw because they want this area to feel dangerous, and deadly has been the prime directive. Mounting up and running through danger can actually be the best defense, so they wanted to find ways around it. And there's a lot of options, but if the final design decision is no mounts, then mounts will likely not be allowed ever in the maw. I remember interviews like this before Shadowlands came out, and worrying that in their enthusiasm to build a zone that is meant to be hell, Blizzard would also forget it's meant to be fun. And not to be smug or anything, but I was right. I couldn't have been more right if I tried. The maw has remained one of Shadowlands' least well-received zones throughout World of Warcraft's history. And I want you to pay attention to why. Because Blizzard bought into this idea that a lack of convenience makes an experience feel bigger, more impressive, and more fun, and then try to force those emotions by restricting convenience. And then I want you to think once again about how well the maw was received. As I said, Blizzard actually changed their approach to flight in Shadowlands a bit. In some ways, they appeared to relax their attitudes towards flight. In other ways, they doubled down on restricting movement even more harshly than before. The philosophy that players should only be allowed to access flight once they've already been forced through experiencing the zone grounded and were pretty much done with it was still thoroughly in place. Patch 9.1 introduced flight to Bastion, Ardenweald, Revendreth, and Maldraxxus, essentially the zones that we were already done with. But the new questing zone was Korthia in the Maw. And you know, Blizzard never allowed flying in the Maw. They had even floated the idea of not ever even allowing ground mounts in the Maw. But by the time of Korthia, they had relented on the mounting up thing a little by introducing special mounts like the Corridor Creeper that could be summoned in the Maw. So early quests in Korthia unlocked ground mounts in the Maw, but not flight. After all, Blizzard wanted you to enjoy this zone and remain pretty much convinced that flight ruins the experience of a zone. Does anyone remember how much players enjoyed Korthia? Once again, I'm not going to blame a complete failure on the lack of flight alone. By the time Korthia was introduced, there were a lot of problems with Shadowlands that had players up in arms. What I will do is highlight that the philosophy behind restricting flight and even normal mounted movement is part of the same outdated philosophy that plagued Shadowlands. This idea that you can force players to experience the game the so-called right way by restricting convenience. Remember, the inability to change covenants was because Blizzard wanted players to feel that they were making a meaningful choice, and that this would help players to feel a greater emotional attachment to their covenant. According to the Wowhead article about an interview Preach did with Ian Hazzikostas that I think was where this whole meaningful choice thing first came from, Blizzard's decision to lock off class abilities in Covenant choice was about identity versus player choice. On one end of the spectrum is permanence. There's no way to change your character once you pick it. On the other end are things that are not part of your identity. Things like your gear, consumables, and talents you're tailoring to the fight. The goal in creating a choice is to make it a difficult one. The choice is what creates depth and creates more variety among the choices that they have taken. And remember, this backfired massively. Blizzard did not achieve the desired effect with this approach. Players did not end up feeling strongly about the covenant they chose in Shadowlands. They only ended up feeling irritated and resenting the inconvenience that was being forced on them, and by extension, the covenants themselves. The same goes for not being able to mount up in the Maw. The Maw never felt bigger or grander or more impressive to players. It certainly didn't end up feeling more fun. It just felt tedious, irritating, and a place they don't ever want to go to again. We're beginning to circle the entire point I want to make here. Shadowlands brought wider flight in 9.2. Still no flight for Korthia or the Maw, but that didn't really matter too much because no one has ever wanted to go back to those zones ever again. The achievement that unlocked flying in the new zone, Zereth Mortis, was essentially another Pathfinder that first forced you to play through the zone in a way where you'd just be about done with it before you could fly. Still, the few people who were still playing Shadowlands by that point did appreciate Zereth Mortis flying once they could unlock it. Overall, Shadowlands did enough damage to World of Warcraft, possibly even worse than Warlords of Draenor, that Blizzard completely changed their approach in Dragonflight. This was the introduction of dragon riding, now known as Skyriding, and with it, flight was once again unlocked almost immediately from the start. This time, the flight was built into the story itself, so you unlocked it really early on. And while, once again, I'm not going to argue that flight was responsible for Shadowlands' failure, I do think the fact that Blizzard themselves made such a bold change to flight is evidence that the approach of trying to force fun by restricting flight had been backfiring enough that even Blizzard knew introducing flight at the start like this would be a massively popular move. And it was. No one can deny how successful dragon riding has been. I maintain that it single-handedly elevated what might otherwise have been remembered as a fairly mediocre expansion into one of the most beloved expansions of all time. You cannot convince me that a grounded dragonflight or a dragonflight locked with pathfinding would have been anywhere as well received or as fun. And frankly, I feel like Dragonflight settled the whole argument. Draenor and Shadowlands are both expansions where Blizzard made extreme decisions based on the argument that grounded or less convenient travel makes the experience more fun. They were the two worst received expansions in World of Warcraft's history, remembered as expansions that caused severe and irreversible damage to the popularity of the game. While you can argue there are other expansions that also restricted flight with things like Pathfinder without too much blowback, you cannot argue that restricting movement in any way enhanced the player's experience. At the very most, you can point to cases where it didn't interfere with the player's experience too much. Dragonflight, on the other hand, was an expansion where Blizzard made the extreme decision to introduce flying from the start. And it was one of the best received expansions in recent history. I've won the argument, with more evidence than I can personally hope for right there. Why are we still arguing about this? I will note that Blizzard did introduce Skyriding somewhat tentatively, with some light restrictions like Vigor and an upgrading track. They also decided to continue to lock normal flight, now known as steady flight, behind a Pathfinder achievement. This was introduced in patch 10.2 and required mostly questing and exploration achievements. And initially, I understood why Blizzard wanted to hold steady flight back. Skyriding is a far more active and engaging form of flight. With Skyriding, you cannot simply point your character in a direction and leave your keyboard, or fly up and park your character outside of harm's way. It was also new, which meant players weren't used to it, which meant at least some players needed to be encouraged into giving it a proper chance, rather than just trying it once and giving up. I still don't think they should have ever locked steady flight, and should have instead trusted themselves to create an option that players would choose because it's fun, but I get the insecurity behind the decision. However, it did soon become very clear that Skyriding is the superior form of travel to nearly everyone. Nobody's going to be choosing steady flight over Skyriding except for two groups. The first is Gatherers, and even there, I don't think I ever see Gatherers using steady flight myself. I know I never use it on my Gathering characters. I really don't think it's true that steady flight gives Gatherers much of a special advantage at all, especially now. But even if they are, who cares? Why are you policing farming, of all things? And the second is people who get motion sickness from Skyriding, or have another accessibility problem with the flight style. Blizzard have tried including accessibility options to limit these negative responses to Skyriding, but those don't solve the problem for everyone. In other words, Pathfinder became an accessibility issue. What I find particularly weird is that Blizzard allowed this problem to continue for so long. There were some allowances. The war within Pathfinder was infinitely more lenient. It just required playing through the story and exploring the zone, rather than as something that was only introduced in a 0.2 patch. Still, the continued existence of the restrictions attached to this achievement didn't make a whole lot of sense when Skyriding was available from day one. Any of the things that are blamed on flight, like being able to fly over enemies or get around the map fast enough so it doesn't feel so big, is still true of Skyriding, even more so. But if you couldn't handle Skyriding due to circumstances outside of your control, and the accessibility options weren't enough to make it accessible to you, then you were punished with this arbitrary and archaic achievement that, let's be honest here, was introduced partly because Blizzard wasn't particularly happy about being forced into reintroducing flying when they wanted to get rid of it. At this stage, Pathfinder was beginning to feel like a monument to a certain stubborn attitude. We made this, and by God, we're going to use it. And it's a shame that this weird display of ego hurt people who do struggle with Skyriding for accessibility reasons for so long. Bringing us to the situation in Midnight. The grand announcement that they're finally getting rid of the Pathfinder requirement for steady flight. Something that, in my opinion, should never have been introduced in the first place, and that certainly had no place in the game at all since at least Dragonflight. Still, the announcement should have been an easy win. But Blizzard really does seem to get weird about flight. They just can't help themselves. They just have to get on the anti-flight soapbox and even drop in that hint that they're going to allow their anti-flight opinions factor into development in the future. The post shows me that Blizzard still hasn't learned the lesson they need to learn about flight, that they're still clinging to outdated myths and prejudices. So let's start with some of the claims that they make about flight. Blizzard begins with their reasons for locking flight in the first place, and it is based on the first myth that flight trivializes the questing experience. Questing through Azeroth has always had a complicated relationship with flying. There are countless cases where the ability to fly trivializes a challenge or ruins the pacing of an experience. An example, in the form of a targeted kill quest. Without flight, players fight their way through an enemy stronghold, taking out guards, keeping an eye out for patrols, and generally being heroic until they ultimately reach their target. The experience tests a few different skills, has a satisfying build-up and conclusion, and matches the player's status as a hero. With flight, the player bypasses all risk, drops right on top of the target's head, kills the target without any repercussions, and then flies away. Yes, the quest is completed much more efficiently, but the shortcut reduces the challenge, removes the elements of gameplay, and robs the player of much of the experience. Blizzard, I know you don't want to hear this, but the problem here isn't flight. If you need to throw tedium in front of players to make your content feel meaningful, you have already failed to design meaningful content. If players find your quest boring, it is not because they could fly there. Again, I ask you to remember just how well players responded to the questing experience in, say, The Maw. I'm going to say this again and again because you would have thought the disastrous decisions in Shadowlands would have driven home this lesson, but apparently not. Making something more tedious does not make it more meaningful, especially when players can see that all you've done is place down arbitrary restrictions. It is the same mistake as covenants. The tedium does not help. It is a transparent attempt at player manipulation that detracts from immersion rather than contributes to it, and it absolutely will only make things worse. Blizzard's choice of specific example also really just doesn't help their case. In the form of a targeted kill quest, without flight, players find their way through an enemy stronghold, taking out guards, keeping an eye out for patrols, and generally being heroic until they ultimately reach their target. First of all, this simply does not describe the modern targeted kill questing experience in World of Warcraft, with or without flight. Players don't take out guards or keep an eye out for patrols or view that as part of the quest unless, and this is important, it's actually listed as part of the quest. And they certainly don't feel heroic killing low-level, low-threat NPCs who respawn soon after you kill them and whose only real purpose is to slow you down and annoy you. No one feels heroic killing these guys. They were never a threat. They were always just a transparent delay tactic that exists only to make a simple quest last longer. I mean, don't get me wrong, I can think of times when Blizzard clearly wanted this to be the entire experience and chose to restrict flight or movement as part of trying to deliver the so-called wonderful heroic adventure during Warlords of Draenor and The Maw in Shadowlands. And Blizzard, it just isn't as engaging as you think it is. If all a quest has to offer is unavoidable tedium, then maybe it's not flight that's making the quest boring. Second, if in fact you do want players to specifically have a fight through a stronghold experience, Blizzard already has multiple ways to ensure that. You make it part of the quest. Quests where you have to sneak past patrols is already a thing that exists. Quests where you have to take out the guards on your way to your target is already a thing. If you really want the target to be at the center of a stronghold, then what is the problem? Players already can't mount up in buildings. What does this have to do with flight? And of course, if you really want the targeted kill to feel heroic, we have delves, dungeons, and raids to help create that effect. The experience tests a few different skills, has satisfying build-up and conclusion, and matches the player's status as a hero. Again, we are talking about forcing players to tediously walk through low-threat mobs who nevertheless slow them down. There is no skill testing here, nothing even remotely resembling a satisfying build-up. I will reiterate, if this philosophy worked, the Maw would have been one of the best designed zones of all time. With flight, the player bypasses all risk, drops right on top of their target's head, kills the target without any repercussions, and then flies away. Again, this is not a flight issue. This is a quest design issue. Why does all the risk inherently have to be tediously fighting your way through mobs? It's a targeted kill quest. The risk should be the target. And what even is the criticism of the player killing the target without repercussions supposed to mean? In the history of World of Warcraft, when has anything that the player has done resulted in repercussions? You're expected to do the quests you're given. What are you expecting from World of Warcraft players here? Agonizing whether or not it's worth the risk of killing some world NPC in a go kill this guy story quest? Maybe doing a quest objective has a predetermined effect on the story that isn't always positive, whether the player participates or not. I didn't personally help drop a mana bomb, but I did help burn Teldrassil. The so-called repercussions were exactly the same either way. I'm not saying that players don't speed through story without paying attention, but it's not flight that's causing them to do this. You know what might be part of the problem? The fact that almost every stay a while, cutscene, and cinematic in Midnight can be missed if you don't happen to click on the dialogue option that starts it. But sometimes if you do start a cutscene, it just replays one you've already seen. So you might not even know that this option plays a new cutscene you haven't seen before. I understand Blizzard is trying to avoid forcing players to sit through exposition they're not interested in, but I really do think players are missing a lot of the story content they would be interested in just because they don't know it's there. What about the fact that players who aren't in a raid team can't experience the full story with everyone else? Even story mode doesn't actually take them through everything that happens in the raid, it just shows them a summarized version of the final fight, a week after everyone else has gotten to experience it. How about the fact that players trying to play through Chromie time to experience old story are locked out of experiencing large parts of the story as they get to it? Sometimes because of bugs or missing content, other times because of arbitrary restrictions, because suddenly you find out you have to be level 30 to play through these quests, or something like that. What about Lorewalker Cho introducing whole new quest signs that have never been in the game before, but only after players have gone through quests that were in the game? Meaning, players who thought, oh, I know these, I played through this, missed the new content. The list of pain points that are causing players to struggle to experience the story is actually endless and could be a whole video on its own. How about you take a look at some of that, Blizzard, before just writing it all up to flight? Now, let me tell you what locking flight behind something like Pathfinder does to my questing experience. First of all, any quest at all that wants me to travel any distance at all irritates me. I do not enjoy running across a map on the ground, having to stop and dismount every few paces to tediously kill mobs. The mobs aren't a challenge because it's world content. The fights aren't meaningful because these are random mobs that mostly feel like they only exist to annoy me. All that's going on is I'm slowed down, kept from doing what I want to be doing, the quest objective, and I'm fully aware that all this annoyance is only happening because Blizzard thinks tedium is a substitute for actually creating engaging content. Because I'm doing something, they think I'm actively engaged. But I'm not. I'm bored. I'm annoyed. I'm barely paying attention. In fact, this is the major thing that happens. When I'm grounded, I do stop paying attention. My mind switches off. If getting through a quest line is the way that I'm going to unlock flying, then you better believe that I'm not even bothering to pay attention to that quest line. And I like the story. I like to take it slow and read through every quest. But tell me I'm grounded until I've sat and listened to your entire story? Then you have designed the game in a way that actively discourages me from paying attention to the story. And this is what I really need Blizzard to understand with their tendency to reach for restrictions in an attempt to cultivate a certain experience. You cannot force players to be interested. You cannot force players to have fun. It won't work. You're just going to annoy people, and the absolute failures of previous attempts to remove convenient travel to make the world feel bigger is proof of that. Being grounded doesn't enhance my enjoyment of anything. It actively dampens my enjoyment of everything. Even when I do try to focus on the story, I really struggle to do that if I'm grounded. It's possible this has to do with my ADHD. Take my reaction to a grounded kill the target quest. I already struggle with feelings of boredom, So the kill this pack of mobs and repeat strategy is not a heroic challenge for me. It's just tedious, to the point of painful. Then by the time I get to the boss, I've forgotten why I was there. I was bored, so I lost focus. I've certainly forgotten what I was even doing by the time I fight my way back and turn in the quest. For years, I wouldn't even try to pay attention to the story until I'd unlocked flying for this reason. Because otherwise it's just too easy for me to hit a boredom wall, which immediately causes my attention to shift. Also, because being grounded makes me hate travel so much, I end up actively avoiding going out of my way. A side quest I don't really need to do that's all the way over there, I'm skipping it. A treasure that's up on that mountain? Yeah, no thank you. A quest line that's beautifully written but requires traveling long distances? Absolutely not, and now I'm mad at you for wanting me to go so far. As for exploration, don't even get me started. Actually, it's too late. Time to cover the second myth. Tell me if you've heard this one before. Flight ruined exploration. When you can just fly to your destination, there is no reason to stop and explore. The world feels small. You don't stop to explore this cave or that village because you just flew past them. This argument drives me a little bit insane because it is so self-evidently ridiculous. Ah yes, exploration, so famously something that only happens when travel is restricted. That's why the development of rockets completely ruined our chances of visiting the moon. It's so logical. Sarcasm aside, in all my time playing World of Warcraft, I have never once started to explore a zone properly before I got flying. Okay, that is a bit of a lie. I do love the original Blood Elf starting area so much I have explored that one mostly completely. And the same goes for Undermine, which is a very special case. And even in those cases, the lack of flying didn't encourage my exploration, though I do like the Undermine car, it is fun. It just didn't discourage it as much as it usually does. In general, being grounded in a zone means I don't want to explore. Why? Because there is nothing interesting or engaging or fun about stopping every 3 minutes to fight random mobs. There is nothing interesting or engaging or fun about seeing a distant place and wanting to go there, but you have to give up part of the way because the pathway up just isn't entirely clear, you keep having to stop to fight mobs, and you run out of time. To illustrate my point, I could talk about the absolute joy I felt while questing through the updated Eversong Woods, where I suddenly remembered about the Brightwing Estate area I used to love, and I quickly flew straight there across the map to look around, and then flew to the area that used to be the Blood Elf starting area because I just felt like it. And then I went back to questing, enriched by this experience of just taking a moment to absorb the beauty of the location I was in. If I didn't have flying, I probably still wouldn't have bothered to visit either of these places. I could talk about the fact that I often swoop around midnight zones just for the joy of seeing what I can find, and did the same in previous zones whenever I unlocked flying. I could talk about how Skyriding especially has enhanced my love for exploration, mentioning how I discovered Ravenholdt Manor this way. I'd never played the Alliance or Rogue quests that send you there, so I hadn't seen it before. But I almost never take flight paths anymore because I enjoy Skyriding so much. And so it was during a flight from one side of the Eastern Kingdoms to the other that I spotted and flew down to explore this location. In fact, I could tell you how I used to be annoyed and upset when I got a quest that expected me to travel a far distance, like from one side of the Eastern Kingdoms to the other, but now I welcome them. I could tell you all of this, and I guess I just did. But I really want to illustrate my point with something that was said by Taliesin, one of the biggest advocates for grounded questing. While talking about how much he enjoyed Harrendar, he re-emphasizes that it was partly due to choosing to stay grounded.
I tell you why I love it.
Well, yeah, I want to hear your take on this.
The perfect combination of like music and vibes and like lore importance, and like it feels special. Harrendar felt very rushed. Again, you got to do that shit on foot, dude, and you got to do the side quests as you go, because like the main story quest, tight as fuck. Yeah,
neat.
absolutely.
Yeah,
if you're doing like the character quests as you go around, it's not. Everything feels good that way, right? And yeah, at this stage, I've got to say, like, you've got the choice make the right choice. Get on your ground mount, do the side quests, and my God, I was blown away. Like,
he then goes on to tell this story.
There was just this moment where I was gonna start streaming, but I was gonna do a tweet before I went on stream, right? And I was like, "You guys had me worried about Harandar, but it's actually all right." And I thought, "Oh, I'll take a picture for my tweet, and I'll make it the World Soul Cradle because I love that shit." And I was like, "I've got to find a good place to take a picture of the World Soul Cradle." And I was like, "Oh, there's a big rock by it, a really high one." So I flew up there to take a photo of my character with the World Soul Cradle behind them, and like, I realized when I got to the top of the rock, there's a table. I clicked on it and it's like, "Do you want to meditate here?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, okay." And then a ghost appeared, like, and it had this really cool like story. And there was an option like, "Do you want to give the ghost that rolled up like blanket that you found earlier?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And I got even more story. And then I was like, "Ooh, well, wait a minute. There's 2 more of these big rocks like sticking out really high up towards the World Soul Cradle." So I got on my mount and I flew over there obviously, and I was like, "Oh," and there were tables on each one, but I didn't have the items for those ones, but it gave me clues as to what the items were. So I didn't look up any guides or anything. I just went down and I found the items after like an hour and a half. My stream like, "Where is he?" And I did it, and I got like the extra ghost and the extra storyline, and there's actually some incredible lore implications about it which are absolutely wild. But then I did it and I started flying off, but then a new treasure had appeared in the pool in the center of like the zone, and I went down, I got the treasure, and it was like I got a new toy and stuff like that. But it was just like, I was just like, this is magical. This is like such a great RPG experience that I'm having here. It was just really, really good.
So, Taliesin, your enjoyment was increased because flying gave you the freedom to explore the zone more than you otherwise would have. Being able to just fly up contributed to your enjoyment of the lore. It assisted with exploration, and it helped pull you into the game in a really engaging way. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that fascinating? I just have to take a moment here to be fair to Taliesin. He has never once called for flying to be taken away. Quite the opposite. Throughout his advocacy for choosing to experience the story grounded, he's emphasized that it's good that flying is unlocked at the start, and that any choice to remain grounded for any period of time should be exactly that, a choice. If Blizzard see the arguments for making that choice and think it's on them to make that choice for players, when nobody asked them to do that, then that's their fault, not his. Taliesin and the others who are advocating for choosing to go grounded are doing nothing wrong. The opposite, in fact. Player-led challenges do enhance the game's enjoyment for those who choose to take part in them. Making a choice like this can be really good and fun. I agree with Taliesin. If you're struggling to connect with the story or the world, maybe you should try this whole grounded thing. I know from experience it doesn't work for me, but maybe it does work for you. I'm not arguing otherwise. The problem comes in when Blizzard decides to try force people to have fun by making choices for them. That said, if Blizzard do bring back pathfinding, then not to overreact or be petty or anything, but Taliesin will be my mortal enemy for the rest of my life, and I will make it my life's work to destroy him. Not Evertel though, Evertel's the best. I am very similar to Taliesin in that being able to just fly up and discover things really enhances my enjoyment of the zone as well. Flying is great, I agree. Sorry, I'll stop now. Meanwhile, if I'm already sick to death of just moving between the quest giver and the quest target because I had to tediously fight my way through 30 nameless mobs, or because a quest designer thought that would somehow make me feel heroic, the last thing I'm going to do is stop and also look around. The absolute last thing. Whereas if I have flight, I will fly up to interesting things the moment I see them. The first thing I did when I got to Koresh, the very first thing, was try to fly straight towards the big purple voidy planet in the sky. And of course, because of all the harmful energy swirling around the Maniforge Omega, I died. And it was so funny, but also such a great way to thoroughly reinforce the level of threat we were dealing with in the story at that point. I still have a very strong emotional attachment to that zone, partly because that was my very first experience in it. I did the exact same thing when I first got to Harandar, flew straight for the big glowing roots in the middle of the map. But the screen flashed white and I woke up near a graveyard. I love this sort of thing. It doesn't matter how often it happens. It's a great bit, it never gets old for me. And here's the thing, I don't think Blizzard really understands why I love flying. In their blog post, they say, players love their mounts, love being efficient, and love seeing the world from above, so flight has stuck around. It's such a dismissive take. Don't get me wrong, I like efficiency as much as the next person. I won't deny that's part of it. I also think it's very dangerous to treat a desire for efficiency as somehow wrong or a bad way to engage with the game. Like most World of Warcraft players, I started playing when I was young and had hours of time to spend on the game. But I'm an adult now, with children and a family and adult responsibilities, and that trademark adult lack of time. I also play World of Warcraft far more than the average player because I'm a World of Warcraft content creator. And I still feel like I barely have time to just play the game and get through the content I enjoy. World of Warcraft players do not need extra tedium slowing us down. We do need efficiency because that is the player base. Things have changed for us as we have gotten older, and the fact that we have less time now is one of those big changes. Blizzard is supposed to respect our time, remember? But it's not efficiency that makes me love flight so much. And it's not seeing the world from above. It's seeing the world, full stop, and there being a world to see. As I've indicated, I've always liked flight, but it was Battle for Azeroth where I really began to feel strongly about this. And Shadowlands just solidified my views. Part of this is because of the contrast between grounded questing and questing with flight in BFA in particular. I'm not sure if this was just my perception, but BFA felt like it was absolutely packed with mobs. You couldn't move 3 feet without being attacked. I especially remember feeling nothing but frustration in Nazmir, which I would avoid like the plague, just because moving around there at all was so painful. But once I unlocked flying, I couldn't believe how much the zone transformed for me, how much I suddenly wanted to explore, how much I found that I just never noticed before. All because I could lift my eyes from the endless mobs that had been keeping me busy until then. Seriously, I quested through this whole area based around the body of a petrified turtle without even noticing the turtle. I only saw it once I got flight. Being grounded makes you notice things more, my eye. To this day, sometimes I just fly around Zandalar, admiring the world, and reflecting on how terrible an idea it was to force players to experience it grounded, all in the name of immersion, as if it's immersive to not be able to see what's actually there because you're too busy in meaningless fights with packs of mobs. Discourages especially feels like it was built to be admired from the air. Talking of which, Battle for Azeroth has 2 major cities, Boralus for the Alliance and Discourages for the Horde. Boralus has gone down in history as one of the most popular cities in the game. Discourages, well, to put it mildly, has not. And this is wild to me, not to mention a literal crime of taste, because Boralus is, oh hell, I'm in trouble anyway, I may as well just say it, a dingy little port. And Discourages is a giant golden ziggurat, one of the most impressive, beautiful and thematic locations ever to be built in World of Warcraft. So what is the difference between these two that made the kind of boring but okay if you like ships one adored and the other far more impressive one hated? Well, when you don't have flying, Boralus is easy to get around and Discourages is not. All of the vendors, the trainers, and everything else you need is central in Boralus. In Discourages, they're all over the place, around the ziggurat. If you head in the wrong direction, it can take you ages to get around to where you're supposed to be. This makes it a bit of a nightmare to navigate, especially on foot. Players complained constantly about how long it took to get around the city, and also how confusing the place was. And I would like to take a moment to illustrate how, while yes, I will rally against the boredom of tedious inconvenience, I don't let the inconvenience stop me from enjoying things that are genuinely good. Because I always loved Discourages. I had never seen something so magnificent before when I first laid eyes on it. It did help that I had engineering and so always had a goblin glider ready to go. I set my hearthstone at the Great Seal, which is in the central highest point of the city, and so from there could glide down to anywhere I wanted. I almost never felt the need to take the long, slow, grounded way around. So the fact that it was tedious on the ground never really got in my way of enjoying the city. I just got to love it from the start. I've had people tell me since that it's not that Discourages was so big and therefore tedious to get around, it's that it was confusing. But it's really not. The layout is actually very straightforward once you get to know it. Far more straightforward than the layout of some modern big cities like Donegal or even Silvermoon. But it's a lot easier to forgive being a little bit confused about where things are when you can quickly correct it because you have flying, than it is when you end up walking around in circles for ages. And yes, I recognize that my disregard for Boralus is a little bit down to taste. I have good taste, it's a curse. No, it is a beautifully designed city if you like that sort of thing. But I am utterly convinced that Discourages deserves a far better reputation than what it got. And it's because a lack of flight made navigating that city tedious. While Boralus, I feel, received far too much praise. Like, I get it, the whole ship fantasy, it is a very cool vibe if you're into that sort of thing. It's still a dingy little port though. Like, am I the only one who sees it's still just a dingy little port? But oh my, the convenience. It has that in spades or in shiploads. Total walkable city. You don't even need grounded mounts to get around. You literally can walk everywhere and it's fine. And then, when Shadowlands rolled around, we saw the lesson that Blizzard learned from players' response to these two cities, and we got Oribos. I did exaggerate about Boralus a bit, but I don't think I'm exaggerating when I call Oribos the worst city in World of Warcraft's history. A boring circle. Convenient, easy to navigate, small, dull, so incredibly, unbelievably dull. And of course, fully grounded. No flying here. That might ruin the experience. Which brings me to this idea that flying somehow ruins exploration because places feel bigger when you're grounded. I get it. I've traveled over the bridge in the Arathi Highlands on Classic. It's cool, I don't disagree, but this argument ignores the flip side of that. Zones that are designed with flying in mind end up with more in them to explore, and that makes them better, more interesting, and more fun. Would Oribos have been so dull if Blizzard ever expected players to be able to fly there? And have you noticed how big and interesting cities have gotten ever since Blizzard started designing for flight? Valdrakken, Donegal, Silvermoon City. Do you think they'd be nearly as grand if players were expected to spend the first 2 patches of the expansion grounded? Or do you think Blizzard would just be too worried about players complaining it takes too long to get around and design around that? Do you think, for example, Eversong Woods would be so full of random but incredible locations like floating islands with wine farms on them if Blizzard hadn't designed the zone with flight in mind? Floating wine farm islands! Classic could never. Taliesin's story about the treasure in Harrendar only happened because Blizzard knew players would be able to fly around Harrendar from the start, so they had to think outside of the box with treasures a bit. Do you remember the sort of treasures we got in Warlords of Draenor? The entertaining and engaging puzzles that were supposed to be so wonderful they were worth keeping everyone grounded for? Jumping puzzles. Endless, non-stop jumping puzzles. This was the original vision and reason to avoid ever giving us flight again, so that jumping puzzles could be called interesting. Blizzard has always resented flying because it does make things a bit more challenging for them. It means they have to innovate and be more creative than telling players to go kill a guy and then just relying on the tedious journey of getting to that guy to be engaging enough that a single quest counts as a whole experience. It means that they can't just slap a treasure onto the tallest branch of a tree and call it a day. But that challenge makes Blizzard better. It makes the game better. Blizzard is at their best when they have to be innovative. That's when they cook the most. They're at their worst when they keep trying to go back to some sort of simpler past, where the world felt big and challenging, and that's why we have meaningful choice and don't have mounted riding in the mall. Getting rid of flight isn't just bad for players, it's bad for Blizzard. What's more, you can still have that super cool experience of the world feeling big because you walked over a hill and something magnificent just came into view, because Blizzard just proved that in Midnight. One of my favorite moments in the Midnight campaign is the transitional bit between Eversong Woods and Zillaman. As you walk up the Amani Pass, the quest has you stopping to talk to NPCs who are standing close enough to each other that it'd just be a waste of time to mount up and fly between each one, but dotted along the steps. And so you end up naturally walking up these steps and seeing the gates of Zulaman appear before you. It's such a fantastic experience. Exactly that larger than life, the world is actually big experience that's supposed to be one of the biggest perks about grounded questing. And it's done in such a perfect way, because instead of forcing players to be grounded the entire questline just so that they can get to this moment, a move that would have caused me to lose interest along the way and therefore would have actually risked me not being present enough to actually enjoy this moment, the game just gently nudges you into walking up the steps just here, just during this bit, with a bit of creative quest design. And in fact, Blizzard already found another incredible solution to the problems that Flight did help cause. That solution was Skyriding. It is true that steady flight is not an engaging form of travel. Even as flight, it is slow, it is tedious, and it requires absolutely zero concentration or attention from the player. Skyriding is deeply engaging. You cannot just aim your character at a destination and pretty much go AFK. You have to be present. And because of that, it is a lot more fun. Everything I've said about flying around old zones, about the joy of exploration, about the fact that I never take flight paths anymore, and even enjoy having a reason to fly long distances now because it means I get to explore along the way, has mostly all been true since Skyriding. Flight did also increase my enjoyment over the grounded experience, but Skyriding was the first thing that made travel itself enjoyable and engaging for me instead of boring and tedious. And because I enjoy travel so much, I travel much more often and explore far more and just do far more as a result. Blizzard's comments about Skyriding, however, suggest they greatly overestimate the so-called restrictions they had in place during Dragonflight. In the Dragonflight expansion, we introduced Skyriding. Skyriding, then called Dragon Riding, was unlocked very early on in the expansion with a restrictive vigor economy to manage. Remember waiting for vigor to recharge? And a complex talent tree to unlock. None of this is what made Dragon Riding engaging. A complex talent tree? Blizzard, it was one line straight down, and you could unlock it very quickly. And the whole remember vigor bit? I have an add-on that still displays vigor, just lining it up with the new cooldowns, and it's barely different at all. The only major difference these days is I get to use Whirling Surge more often, which is good because Whirling Surge is aesthetically pleasing and therefore more fun. But don't trick yourself into thinking Skyriding used to be challenging and now it's not. That's just not true. As I said, restricting steady flight at this stage was an accessibility issue. That's really the only reason to still use it. Otherwise, Skyriding tends to be player's choice. Not because it's forced on them, just because people like it. So, I'm glad steady flight has finally been removed from Pathfinder. I really don't think it risks everyone suddenly switching to steady flight, but if people do, well then I'm glad they get to choose what's best for them. And I swear to God, the war I will start if Blizzard decides to add Skyriding to a future Pathfinder will make Garrosh look like a humanitarian. Now, don't get me wrong here. When people say choosing to stay grounded enhances the questing experience for them, I believe them. I even believe them when they say you should try it if you haven't already. All I ask is for the same courtesy. For some reason, even though I have been saying flying massively improves my enjoyment of exploring both the world and the story for years, my claims are repeatedly dismissed. I'm met with this patronizing attitude of disbelief that I can't really be right. I only think that because I don't know any better. I'm just lazy. I just want convenience. It's very, you think you do, but you don't. And we all know how well that attitude goes down with players in general. I think this is what drives me up the wall about the flying debate. If everyone has flying, absolutely nothing is stopping you from choosing to stay grounded, as we can see in Midnight with this trend of players making that choice. But for some reason, that's not enough. It's not enough that you like to stay grounded. Everyone else has to stay grounded as well. For some reason, a lot of people who prefer the ground are very weirdly evangelical about it. It's not enough that they make the choice. They need you to be there making that choice with them. And if you don't, well then maybe it should be forced on you. This alone suggests to me that the argument against flying is not as strong as people would like. That there's a bit of insecurity in people's decisions when they go grounded that's causing them to seek the outside validation that is everyone else agreeing with them and choosing the same thing. Because you know what you don't have to force onto people? Something they naturally want to do because it's fun. All that said, I do want to re-emphasize again that I do believe players making that choice are having fun. Of course they are. They've made the choice without being forced into it. And I think it's wonderful. I love that players are choosing to do this. Seeing the passion of someone like Taliesin as he talks about it just puts me in a good mood, because I do always enjoy it when other people are having as much fun in the game as I am. The freedom that Blizzard has helped create by loosening restrictions has made space for players to do something like this. And that's incredible. Player-led movements are exactly the sort of thing you want in an MMO like World of Warcraft. They're impossible to force, impossible to create artificially, and so when they do happen, it's magical. It's good for the game, which is good for players, and is good for Blizzard. The worst possible thing that Blizzard could do now is see all of this as some sort of validation for their own outdated philosophies about flight. Ignore those tempting whispers telling you that players want you to take flight away, Blizzard. They've only ever led you down a dark path before. Restricting movement does not make people like boring quests. The genie does not fit and will not go back in the bottle. Don't do it. Remember Warlords of Draenor. Remember them more. Remember Dragonflight. To quote Taliesin.
And yeah, at this stage, I've got to say, like, you've got the choice. Make the right choice.
If you enjoyed this video, you know you can like, share, comment, thank my patrons whose names you can see now, all the good YouTube stuff. Otherwise, I stream both here and on Twitch, so hopefully I'll see you again soon.